This Bumblebee Batteries video will show you how to replace the IMA battery pack on a first-generation Honda Insight. If this is your first time installing an IMA battery, you should expect it to take you between 2 and 3 hours, but we recommend budgeting 4 hours just in case. Some heavy lifting is involved, so you'll want to make sure you have someone who can serve as a helper for those parts. It should be acknowledged that replacing the IMA battery is inherently dangerous as it involves working on high-voltage circuitry. While the procedure is fairly safe, it does mean that you need to make sure to follow all the safety steps detailed in the video. Now that we're ready to get started, let's take a look at the necessary tools. To begin with, you'll need a box cutter to carefully open the packaging for later reuse. The majority of the work will be done with a metric ratchet set, and you'll use the 8, 10, and 12 millimeter sockets. You'll need an 8-inch or longer extension, but if you don't have one, you might be able to make a suitable length extension by combining two smaller extensions. You'll need 8 and 10 millimeter wrenches. You'll need a Torx T30 star bit. You'll need Phillips and flathead screwdrivers. And finally, you'll need a voltmeter for safety purposes. In addition to the necessary tools we just saw, there are some optional tools that can make the job a little easier. The most helpful thing of all is a pair of needle nose pliers, which can make it a lot easier to detach some of the nylon fasteners on various cables. A trim removal tool is great for taking off plastic clips and can help prevent you from accidentally breaking them during removal. Drivers can speed up the process of removing bolts. However, if you use them for installing bolts, be careful. Make sure you do the final tightening by hand and not by driver. Finally, it's great to have a set of plastic baggies and plain old tape for keeping your bolts and clips grouped together by panel to ensure nothing gets lost. Now that we've gone over all the tools, we're ready to begin the installation. Start off by unpacking your new battery. Be careful to avoid damaging any of the packaging because you'll want to reuse it to send back your old battery when you're done. Get a helper to give you a hand in removing the battery. Remember, it's very heavy. Underneath the battery is the return shipping label. Make sure to retain it for later use. Use a box cutter to cut the packing tape that holds the bubble wrap in place. Try to avoid cutting the bubble wrap though. You'll need it again later. Notice that there are two end caps of bubble wrap taped in place on either side of the roll. You'll want to cut these out as well. Unroll the bubble wrap from the battery. As you work, keep a knife close at hand to cut any extra bits of tape that are holding the wrap in place. You'll probably want a helper for this part as well. Once the bubble wrap is off, remove the packing foam from the battery. Remember to retain all the packing material for later shipping of the old IMA battery. Now that the new battery is unpacked, we can start on the car. Safety first. We'll be working on a high voltage electrical system, so it's important to follow safety procedures. Before beginning work, disconnect the 12-volt battery under the hood by detaching the negative terminal. The majority of the work will take place in the cargo compartment through the hatch. Pull up the rear carpeting, which is velcroed in place, then lift it out of the compartment. After you finish pulling out the carpet, remove the storage box at the rear of the car. You'll need to bend it quite a bit to get it out, but don't worry, it's pretty resilient. In the middle of the main cover plate is a little hatch. Open this first. This takes a 10mm socket, as do almost all the other hex bolts you'll encounter. Inside the little hatch is the switch to the IMA battery, which needs to be turned off. The switch should have a plastic cap holding it in place. Remove the cap by lightly prying it off with a flathead screwdriver. Once the cap is off, flip the switch to the off position, then replace the cap, now in the opposite direction, to ensure the IMA system stays off while you work on it. Next, remove the plate at the rear on the passenger side. This is held in by a combination of 10mm bolts and plastic clips. On this Insight, there are plastic clips that came out with a Phillips screwdriver, along with plain push-in clips that could be popped out by prying with a flathead. You'll probably see the same clips when you work on your Insight, but it could be different depending on previous work. Once all the clips are removed, lift out the metal plate. Now begin to remove the main cover plate. There are 6 Torx T30 bolts split between the right and left sides. The remainder of the bolts are 10mm. There are quite a few, so make sure to remove them all. It should be noted that this specific car necessitated the use of an impact driver. Many of the bolts had been so over-tightened by some previous mechanic that they couldn't be removed with a ratchet. This probably won't be the case with your car, but it's a good reminder to avoid over-tightening the bolts during reinstallation. In addition to the many bolts on top, there are 3 bolts towards the rear of the car. Remove these as well. At this point, you'll have a whole lot of loose bolts. Placing them in a plastic baggie can really help you avoid losing any, and if you tape the baggie to the panel they came from, you won't lose track of where they go. In addition to all the obvious bolts in the main cover, there is one small, hard-to-notice 8mm bolt right next to the battery switch. Since the bolt is so small, it can be easy to forget, but make sure to take it out. If you accidentally leave it in, it's capable of bending the metal when you pull off the main cover plate. For the next part, you'll remove plastic trim pieces from both sides of the car at the front. Start off by removing the door sill trim. Grab from the bottom edge and lift up. The clips holding it in place should simply pop out. Next, remove the plastic trim that covers the seatbelt. Begin at the bottom edge and start by gently prying it off. Once you get the bottom started and the plastic is pulled out slightly, reach in with your other hand and use it to push out at the location of each plastic clip. Finally, there is one last clip at the top of the plastic piece towards the rear of the car. Slide your hand behind the plastic, push to pop the clip out of place, then remove the plastic trim from the car. A lot of what makes this so difficult is that you can't see the clips, so here's a view behind the plastic. There are a total of 4 clips. Double check that none of them stay stuck in the car when you pull out the trim. Here's a close-up view of how the plastic clips are mounted in the panel. If any of the clips break during removal, you can purchase new clips at most auto stores and simply slide the replacements into position. Once the plastic trim has been removed on both sides, you'll need to pull back the carpet from the crossbar in the middle of the car. The carpet is held in place by a few plastic clips. If you have a trim removal tool, that's great, but if you don't, it's not much harder to pry them up with a flathead screwdriver. Like before, don't worry if some of the clips break during removal, you can always buy more of them. Once you've finished removing all of the clips that are holding the carpet down, flip the carpet out of the way, then remove the bolts holding the crossbar in place. In addition to the bolts attached to the main cover plate, there are 2 bolts on the top of the crossbar, one on each side. Remove these as well. Finally, there are some crossbar bolts on the side that faces the front of the car. There are a total of 6 bolts on this side. You'll have to pull the carpet back a fair amount so you can get access to them. It's easy for the carpet to hide them, so make sure to get them all. Once they're out, the crossbar is loose and can be removed. To remove the crossbar, lift it straight up, then carefully pull it out of the car at a diagonal. It definitely doesn't hurt to have a helper for this part either. With the crossbar out, you can now remove the main cover plate. Lift straight up, then pull it out diagonally as well. When removing the metal pieces, be careful not to bump the car as it might scratch the paint. At this point, you finally have access to the battery compartment. Before you start disconnecting the battery though, there is an air duct near the passenger seat. Remove the bolt holding the duct in place. Later on, you'll need to get access to something underneath the duct, and while you won't be able to remove the duct, you will be able to pull it to the side. Next, remove the styrofoam covers. Lift straight up and remove them carefully. They'll go back in place after installing the battery, so retain them. They insulate the battery and direct airflow. You're now ready to disconnect the battery, but there's an important safety step to do first. The thick wires bolted to the battery on the driver's side are connected to the battery terminals. Use a voltmeter to check the voltage here. Since the battery is off, you should see very little voltage. If you only see a few volts, you're safe to continue. On the other hand, if you see more than 10 volts, stop work. Double check that you disconnected the 12-volt battery under the hood and that you turned off the IMA battery. If you did both of those and still see more than a few volts, contact Bumblebee Batteries. Seeing a significant voltage here is extremely unlikely, but it's important to be cautious and double check since it has the potential to be quite dangerous. After checking the voltage, unbolt the connections to the battery. This is a good time to point out that many of the bolts in this area have a red-orange substance on them. This substance can come off, so be careful to keep it from staining your clothes or anything else. Once you've disconnected the high current wires, there are some other bolts to remove in the area. First, there's a metal brace towards the rear of the car. It's bolted in place on both ends. Make sure to keep track of the bolts once they're out. Either place them in a baggie or put them back where they came from so you can find them later. Next, unbolt the grounding wire from the battery. You'll also notice that the wire is held in position by a nylon clip. You can remove it by squeezing on both sides of where the clip pushes in. You'll probably be able to do this by hand, but you can use needle nose pliers if necessary. Once all the wires are off the battery, you can start unplugging the various connectors. The hardest connector to deal with is a large gray plug that's towards the rear of the car. Before it can be unplugged, it must be removed from the metal bar holding it in place. The plug has a plastic tab near the battery. Push this tab towards the battery and simultaneously slide the plug off the metal bar. Once the plug is off the metal bar, it can be unplugged by pushing the release at the bottom and pulling the two halves apart. There are now a bunch of connectors on the top to unplug. First, unplug the connector on the far passenger side towards the front. This plug powers the fan on the battery. The 2 metal boxes on top are the computers that regulate the battery. Pull out both of the plugs that are towards the rear end of the car. These plugs have releases on the bottom that you have to push up on with your finger. Next, pull out the cluster of 3 plugs on the driver's side of the car towards the front. Start off by simply pulling out the gray plugs. The blue one is a little harder though. To remove the blue plug, push in the upper tab while pulling on the plug. The difficulty with this plug is that it kind of sticks and isn't mounted very strongly, so we recommend using your other hand to hold the bottom half in place while you pull the plug apart. Finally, remove this plug from the computer, but none of the others towards the front of the car. You can identify which plug to remove by its large, multicolored wire strand. Like the other computer connectors, push up on its underside to release it. To review, there are a total of 3 connectors to be removed from the computers, 2 towards the rear of the car and 1 towards the front. In addition to those, there's the cluster of 3 plugs towards the driver's side of the car and the single fan plug in the corner on the passenger side. The rack holding the computers in place now needs to be unbolted from the battery. There are a total of 8 bolts that need to be removed. 7 of them are easy to access from the top, but one of them is covered by the orange cable. To get access to this final bolt, undo the nylon clips holding the cable in place by squeezing both sides. Once the cable is unclipped, lift it out of the way and remove the final bolt. Next, remove the metal brace that is towards the front of the car. This one's a little harder to spot than the earlier one since it's covered by some wires. Unbolt each end of the brace. Unlike the previous metal brace, you will not be able to remove this one. That's okay. Just push the brace back a little to make sure it's loose. All that matters is for it to not get in the way when you remove the battery in a few minutes. Now that everything is disconnected from the battery, you're finally ready to remove the mounting bolts holding it in place. Start with the 2 bolts towards the front end of the car located between the battery box and the passenger compartment wall. All of the mounting bolts use a 12mm socket, so switch to that along with an extension so you can reach them. It's a little more difficult to get access to the other bolt. It's under the air duct that you previously unbolted. Pull the duct to the side so you can reach the bolt below it. Now that the front mounting bolts have been removed, the computers can be flipped out of the way. Remember that the other wires are still connected, so flip them back carefully. Once they're out of the way, remove the metal rack they live in. Finally, take out the last 2 mounting bolts located near the rear end of the car. As before, you'll need a 12mm socket. With these bolts out, the battery is at last ready to be removed from the car. Remember that the battery is very heavy though, so make sure you have a helper for this next part. There are many ways to approach lifting the battery out. One way is to remove the spare tire from the car so one person can stand inside the car and be closer to the battery while lifting. There are a total of 3 handles on the battery. Have the secondary lifter grab the side handle from outside the car. The primary lifter should grab the remaining 2 handles. Lift the battery up and out of the car. Take care not to scratch the car's paint with anything hard, such as belt buckles or the bottom of the battery. It helps to have a sturdy table behind the car so the battery can immediately be put down after lifting. Make sure to lift up, then out while removing the battery. After removing the battery, place the ends of the high current wires so they touch each other. This will prevent any static electric charge from building up in the system. If something comes up and you have to take a break for more than an hour, hold the 2 wires together with some sort of clip. The last thing we have to do to the old battery is remove the fan assembly from it. Undo the nylon clips holding the fan cable in place. Like before, squeeze each clip on both sides to remove. Once the cable is loose, unbolt the fan assembly from the front of the battery. There are a total of 8 bolts holding it in place. Notice how it's helpful to do this work on something elevated since it gives you clear access to the bolts. The majority of them are easy to get to and remove, but the middle 2 on top don't have as much clearance. Use a wrench to get these bolts started. Make sure to support the fan assembly as you take off the final bolts to prevent it from falling to the ground. Now you can finally get rid of the old battery. With it out of the car, notice how the mounting legs make great grip points for lifting the battery. Put the old IMA battery somewhere safe until you get a chance to pack it up for return shipping. Grab your new Bumblebee battery and place it on the work surface so you can prepare it for installation. Before you get started though, make sure the battery switch is in the off position. If your new battery didn't come with a cap for the switch, grab the cap from the old IMA battery and use it to lock the new battery in the off position for installation. While you're at it, use the voltmeter to check that the new battery is at 0 volts. If it's more than a couple volts, stop work and contact Bumblebee. Once again, it's unlikely, but it's important to be safe. From here on out, everything is just a reversal of what you did to uninstall the old battery. Start off by reattaching the fan assembly. In general, for the entire reinstallation process, make sure to tighten all the bolts by hand and be careful to avoid over-tightening. For the majority of the bolts, a good snug fit will be enough. Now that the fan assembly has been attached, clip the fan cable in place. Push the nylon clips through the holes to lock them in position. The new battery is now ready to be installed, so position it somewhere you can easily lift it from. As before, make sure you have a helper to assist you with the lifting. Take the same handholds as last time and lift the battery into its position. You want to come down from above, then slide in the last little bit. Once again, make sure you don't scratch the car during this step. Place the battery down gently and carefully to avoid accidentally crushing anything. With the new battery in place, make any fine adjustments necessary to line up the mounting legs with their corresponding holes. Once the legs are aligned, start screwing in the mounting bolts. Start the bolts with your fingers. If you can do it with your fingers, the holes are properly aligned. If you need a tool, they are not in alignment. Don't tighten the mounting bolts yet, just get them started for now. Now that the battery is in place, put the metal computer rack back on top, flip both computers back down into the rack, then install the 8 bolts that hold the assembly in place. Plug in the 3 connectors in the corner. Again, the blue plug is not mounted very strongly, so support the bottom while you push it in. The gray plugs are different shapes, so you don't have to worry about accidentally plugging either of them into the wrong socket. Insert the computer connector towards the front of the car, plug in the fan cable on the corner of the battery, insert the other 2 computer connectors that are towards the rear of the car, and then snap in the 2 nylon clips that hold the orange cable in place. While you're working on top of the battery, install the metal brace towards the front. Line up the holes using one hand while installing bolts with your other hand. As before, start both bolts with your fingers to make sure that the brace is aligned. Once they're started, you can switch to a tool to tighten them down. Next, install the rear brace in a similar fashion. Line up the holes, get both bolts started using your fingers, then switch to a tool for final tightening. The final plug to be connected is the large gray plug towards the rear of the car. Push the 2 ends in until they click together, then slide the plug onto the metal tab to lock it in place. The last connections left for the battery are bolting in the wires. Reattach the high current wires to the battery and tighten them down. Reinstall the grounding wire by putting the bolt through the ring terminal, then tightening it in place. Once the wire is connected, snap in the nylon clip next to the bolt. Move to the passenger compartment to bolt down the other 2 mounting legs. It's difficult to get access here, but you should be able to reach the hole on the driver's side. As before, get the bolt started with your fingers. If you require the torque of a tool to start the bolt, things aren't aligned. The passenger side has less room to work, but if you hold the bolt with your fingertips, you can reach down enough to drop it into the hole. Be careful though, if you miss, it will be a pain to retrieve the bolt. Because of the tight space, you won't be able to tighten it with your fingers, but you can effectively do the same by using the extension without the ratchet. Once all 4 mounting bolts, that's 2 in the front and 2 in the rear, are finger tight, go back through with the ratchet and tighten them down firmly. Finally, while you're still up in the front, replace the bolt that holds the air duct in place and tighten it down snugly. Next, go back around to the rear and finish tightening down the other 2 mounting bolts. After you finish tightening all 4 bolts, go through and double check them. These mounting bolts are all that holds the battery in place, so you want to make sure that they're tight. Grab the styrofoam covers and put them back in their old locations. Remember to slide them in from above. At this point, the battery is fully installed. Now it's just a matter of closing access to the compartment. Put the main cover plate back in place and try to align it with the holes as much as you can. Begin to install the many bolts that go in the cover, starting with the small bolt in the center that's located next to the battery switch. You'll have to sort out your Torx bolts from your hex bolts. There are a total of 6 Torx, 3 to each of the far sides. The hex bolts will fill in the remainder of the holes. As before, you're trying to make sure everything is properly aligned, so start all the bolts using your fingers and don't tighten anything down yet. Don't forget about the 3 bolts near the rear of the car located on the lower portion of the cover. After all the cover bolts have been started, put the crossbar back in place. Bring it in diagonally, then lower it down into position while holding the carpet out of the way. Once the crossbar is in place, install the 2 bolts that go in the top of the bar. Next, install the 8 bolts on the rear side that attach the crossbar to the main cover plate. Finally, to finish installing the crossbar, put in the 6 black-colored bolts that go on the front side just beyond where the carpet is attached. As before, start the bolts lightly, then go through after they're all in place and finish tightening them down. With the crossbar now installed, go back through the cover plate bolts and do the final tightening on them as well. Don't forget to tighten the lower bolts towards the rear, and also remember to tighten the Torx bolts. Next, replace the rear passenger side cover plate and lock it in place. Remember, this is held in by a combination of plastic clips and bolts. Return to the front of the car to reinstall the plastic trim. Start by pulling the seatbelt out of the way, then flip the carpet back down over the crossbar and smooth it into place. Once the carpet looks good, slide the large plastic panel over the carpet and make sure the seatbelt on the wall slots into it properly. Get the top pin into its hole, then work your way down the panel, pushing the other 3 pins into place as well. Once the large panel is done, slot in the door sill trim. Don't forget to do this procedure on both sides. Once you've finished installing the trim pieces, smooth out the rest of the carpet and put in the plastic push clips that hold the carpet in place over the crossbar. You're finally ready to turn on the IMA battery. Pop off the switch cap that you've been using as a safety, flip the switch into the on position, then replace the cap to lock the switch at on. Now put the switch cover back in place and replace the bolts that hold it down. Take the storage box that goes in the rear of the car and shove it back into its position just above the spare tire. Grab the rear carpeting and put it back in place. Once it's all in, make sure to smooth the edges and corners into their proper positions. And for the final step, close up the safety procedure you opened with. Reattach the negative terminal wire on the 12-volt battery to finish reconnecting your car's electrical system. The installation is now complete. Get in the car and start it in neutral. After it starts, simply let the engine idle for 5 or 10 minutes. You'll see a few bars of charge and the state of charge at nothing. This is because the 12-volt battery was disconnected, so the car is doing a recalibration. Over the next few minutes, the computer will realize it has a charged IMA battery, and you'll see the state of charge gauge fill up. At this point, the car is ready to be driven. We think you're really going to enjoy driving your Insight with a Bumblebee IMA battery. Thanks for purchasing from Bumblebee Batteries, and we wish you many miles of happy driving with your new battery.